Cathy, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really exciting for you to be able to talk about the parts that are in your book that are important and what people need to know about this.
Really, my focus is politicians, the police, and the public. I say the 3 Ps, and I focus on the 2 Es, enforcement of a great law that we have, and education. So I keep it very simple. I really want to emphasize we have a fantastic law in Canada. We are so far ahead. I wish the public knew about it. It's called the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. That law is not being enforced hardly anywhere. And what I've discovered, openness, transparency, bringing these dark issues out into the light is how we actually stop them.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Well Informed, where we dive deep into challenging yet crucial issues impacting our communities. My name is Colton Easton. I am your host for today's podcast, and today we're honored to have Cathy Peters join us, a staunch advocate against human trafficking and a dedicated author. Cathy has spent years fighting to end sexual exploitation, bringing her deep insights to policymakers, law enforcement, and of course the public. So in today's conversation, we'll explore Cathy's journey, her impactful work, and the strategies that she believes are vital in combating human trafficking. So stay tuned as we uncover the realities of these really global issues, but how they make our way into our communities, and more importantly, how we can make our communities safer. So enjoy the episode, and thanks for listening.
Cathy, thank you so much for joining us today. Good morning.
Colton, thank you for having me. This is awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great space, and it's a good way to share information. So, just before we were talking about how you kind of got connected with SST and Jesse, and like how that broached that relationship, because I was talking to Jesse to be like, hey, who else can we talk about with anything that we need to know about, would be good to interview for this. And he's like, I actually just met this wonderful person, Cathy. I'm reading her book. It sounds amazing. She's hitting all the right marks. And I'm like, this is perfect. So it's really exciting for you to be able to talk about the parts that are in your book that are important and what people need to know about this. So thank you for being here.
Thank you again for having me. Awesome.
Yeah. So I think we're going to get right into it, and just to talk about, your work, because how long did you say you've been doing this for?
45 years.
Okay. That's a long time.
Long time.
That's a long time. And I'm sure in that 45 years, there's been so many nuances and changes that have been in this child sex trafficking ring. And obviously you focus primarily in British Columbia, but that's obviously not been the case, because you've been saying it's kind of impacted a lot more than just British Columbia. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, the whole thing has exploded is all I can say. I mean, I started 45 years ago when I was an inner city high school teacher in the Lower Mainland area. I was a junior high school teacher, and I taught vulnerable youth and from a very vulnerable area. So I saw it back then. And without going into all the steps it took me to get to this point of writing a book and coming up with a website, the turning point was definitely Christine. And I must tell that story because
Please.
I promised her I would
Please.
tell the story. So our son worked for Joy Smith, and Joy Smith is the member of parliament who introduced our 3 human trafficking laws. And he worked for her for a number of years, and I would volunteer. So I would go to Ottawa, I'd go to Winnipeg. So I was given the assignment of taking care of this gal who wanted to tell her story, who had been sex trafficked, starting at age 11, which was just unbelievable. So I took care of her for 3 days, and she told her story at a gala on CBC News, Winnipeg, the radio, and she just told her story. And it was her story that has definitely changed my life. It's changed the trajectory of my life. And I heard her, it was 10 years ago. And what happened was she came from a family, 6 children. She was the oldest daughter, very successful, straight A student, played the flute, was a track star. But the family fell apart because Dad was drinking alcohol. So all 6 children, this is not uncommon, were put into foster care.
Oh, wow.
And the foster father sexually molested her. But bright girl, she knew this was wrong.
Right.
And she ran. But this is in Toronto. So within 2 hours, she was picked up by an older gentleman who said, come home with me. I've got a whole house full of girls just like you. And that night she was servicing men sexually, and she was on cocaine and alcohol. She was servicing men 7 days a week for the next 10 years.
Jeez.
And for her to get out is a miracle, because most don't. By far, most don't get out at all. So she was anxious to tell her story. That's very dangerous to do.
Right.
When you've been sex trafficked, once you're in the sex industry, you don't get out. It's very organized crime. Gangs are very involved with this. So it was a real risk for her to do it, but she was quite passionate. And so I was sort of glued to her for 3 days, heard her story. And coming back to the hotel in the taxi, I said to her, and Joy Smith was sitting in the front seat and still reminds me of this, I said to Christine, I'm going to stop this in British Columbia. I didn't say Canada, because I knew that was too big. I'm from BC. I said, I'm going to stop this in BC, because she got into this at age 11. How is that even possible? That children, and she's Caucasian, how is that even possible that children are being bought and sold for sex in Canada? And this is a country renowned for human rights and gender equality. So I was beside myself. Also, we have daughters about the same age as her, and that's why I made the promise. And I have not stopped for 10 years. And it's just been ongoing. I mean, I started in my own community, and my focus has always been British Columbia, but inadvertently, I've been discovered nationally and internationally, and I just present wherever I can. My goal is simply to get the information out there,
right,
so we can stop this.
Absolutely. And yeah, amazing story. And the success stories are always the foundation of what makes this prevention work so important. So that's amazing to hear Christine's story, and what she had suffered through, and being able to be an advocate for that, because, we have individuals that will speak in terms of, gang involvement and those success stories, but they're few and far in between. So it's really important to see those and use those, because there are some that also are survivors that don't choose to advocate for this work. They just want to go about their own life, and that's totally fair. So these small success stories, being able to shine light on the really important things that are going on. So you did briefly talk about the focus in British Columbia, but also the global versus that. So can you talk a little bit about the balance between the local and international aspects of the trafficking research that kind of goes into and your talks, as you talk with folks in British Columbia, or you talk with folks in Ottawa, or even in the US? What goes into that?
Okay, so my focus is politicians, the police, and the public. I say the 3 Ps, and I focus on the 2 Es, enforcement of a great law that we have, and education. So I keep it very simple. In terms of my focus was British Columbia, and sort of the magic of what I do is I do present to all 3 levels of government.
Right.
You have to do that. So I present to civic, provincial, and federal simultaneously. And because I don't want silo mentality, I want everybody at the table together, everybody discussing this and working this together. So if I could simplify, my success at any of this has been because I work with all 3 levels of government. And in British Columbia, all politicians know who I am and what I do. Because I do nonstop presentations, again, whether it's city councils, regional districts, the provincial government, to their caucuses. I'm at UBCM, which is the big convention every year with all the politicians in BC. And then with the federal MPs, they all know me. And of course, I've been flown to Ottawa because they've heard what I'm doing. I really want to emphasize, we have a fantastic law in Canada. We are so far ahead. I wish the public knew about it. It's called the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, or PSEPA. That is a law we definitely don't want to lose, because it addresses the root cause of the problem, which is the sex buyer. Now, they're kind of invisible when it comes to sex trafficking and child sex trafficking, but who's actually buying those children for sex?
Right.
They're the sex buyers. So we actually have a law in place that criminalizes the sex buyer. But that law is not being enforced hardly anywhere in Canada, and certainly not in British Columbia. It's not a focus. So PSEPA, there's 4 parts to it. I'll keep it really simple. Number 1, it criminalizes the sex buyer, the trafficker, and the profiteers. Number 2, the sex seller. is immune from prosecution, recognized as a victim. Number 3, there's supposed to be an off-ramp exit strategies to help them out of the sex industry. We're not good on that in British Columbia, although I like the work of Covenant House, and I love the work of Salvation Army Illuminati because they have full, 24/7 wraparound programs,
Right.
which are effective and do work. And then the 4th part is supposed to be a robust prevention education. We're very poor on that here in British Columbia, and actually for Canada as well. So even though we've had this federal law in place since 2014, it never got a proper national rollout campaign. So I would say the public don't have any awareness about this,
Right.
let alone frontline service providers or teachers or anybody who would normally recognize this. There wasn't a public awareness program. So, and I know this is one of your questions later, but you're going to ask me, what's my biggest problem? My biggest problem is convincing Canadians and British Columbians this is even happening.
Right.
I mean, child sex trafficking in Canada, there's no book like this in the country. And people are Canadians, we're so nice and pleasant, and we don't talk about these awful, nasty things. But this is a huge problem. So I hope that answers your questions. That's how I've started very local, and this has spread globally because ultimately this is a global issue. Yeah. And again, I want to give 4 factors that cause human trafficking. Again, I'll keep it simple. Number 1 is globalization. Number 2 is unregulated technology. We all know about that. That's a big problem. Number 3 is limited law enforcement. We say 70% of law enforcement officers have no training on human trafficking. So they don't recognize it. They don't know where to get help. And number four is we have almost no prevention education. That's why I'm so thrilled to be asked to be on this podcast. You are cutting edge. You are right on time. By even doing this podcast, you are saving lives.
Yeah.
Because hopefully there's going to be a lot of educators and teachers and parents that listen to this.
Yep.
And then you're going to start to go, oh, wait a minute, that's what's going on. That's all that's needed. And we can turn back the dial on this crime really quickly.
And seeing all the signs. So yeah, there's a couple of things I want to follow up on that, which is really, really interesting. So the Peace EPA law that you talked about, you were talking about some of the ways to intervene, the intervention for an education. Now, is it those who are in the work themselves who are the victims, or are you talking about education prevention for the buyers?
Oh, that was just the most brilliant question. For both.
Right.
We need education for the sex buyers because the men that buy, and let me give you the demographic, they're usually over 50, are married, have a family, have a graduate degree, make over $100,000 a year so they can afford to get the expensive lawyer to get them off. Those are the sex buyers in Canada. So they're well-to-do. They're privileged. I hate to say that they're all white. They aren't necessarily all white, but they're well-to-do. They're the judges, the doctors, the lawyers, they're executives, but they can be construction workers. They can be pastors, and they can be any man. But typically, what they'll say is, generally, most of them are ignorant. They think the girls actually want to do this. So they're ignorant and they don't necessarily understand the harm that they're causing.
Right.
So education for the sex buyer. And actually my whole focus, I suppose, is really we have to reach men and boys.
Yeah.
We have to teach them that women are not sex objects.
Yeah.
And for anybody that's watching pornography out there, I'm going to say stop watching. That is not, that is all a lie. And men and boys today are very hooked on pornography. We're not even talking about that.
Yeah, 100%. And I think there's so much that goes into that and what influences a lot of our youth. And, I see this from the social media perspective, not just in terms of healthy relationships and building healthy relationships, which that is actually something that we do present to a lot of our youth on is what does a healthy relationship look like? And it should look no different online than it should in person in these aspects. And, while we don't explicitly mention pornography, it does play a huge role because, to your point, it's not a depiction of what relationships look like. And if we don't have that conversation of this is not correct, this is, just like any other social media, right? You're getting the highlights of people's lives or whatever it could be, something that's not real. and you bring that into a real life relationship, that does cause a lot of issues. And to your point, where that leads down the future for somebody who doesn't have that education for all these years and this idea. So I really like the aspect that it's not just the prevention, intervention, education, enforcement for the victims, but it's also for the people who are buying these things or purchasing and being involved in that, because that's, again, needed as well.
So I would say right now we really have a man and boy crisis. So there's some organizations, and I'd love you to interview them. A Moosehide Campaign comes to my mind. The Boys Club Network, they've been very successful here in the Lower Mainland, and they're really spreading. They're just trying to teach men and boys what good men look like.
Yeah.
And the key is to have healthy role models, obviously.
Of course.
Again, I want to emphasize pornography is the fuel for all of this. And I mean, Pornhub is out of Montreal. I don't even know why they're allowed in Canada.
Right.
And pornography is very, very addictive. We call it the new crack cocaine. So anytime I present, even in high schools, politicians, I always mention the porn piece. And again, my observation is nobody is doing that. And there really are two pipelines for children to be sex trafficked, and it is pornography and it is childhood sexual abuse. And now incest. Nobody wants to talk about incest, but the more I present, the more people are telling me their stories of incest. We've got to use these words that are loaded. I know it's uncomfortable, but we've got to bring this out in the open. And what I've discovered, openness, transparency, bringing these dark issues out into the light is how we actually stop them. And in case you haven't picked up my passion by this point, I am very passionate. I am a grandmother, and my goal, and what I promised Christine, as I said at the beginning, is I want to stop this.
Right.
So the only way we're going to stop it is we have to have the really uncomfortable conversations about what works and what doesn't work. And I want to add to your point about healthy relationships. That is the number one question I'm asked when I present in high schools.
Right.
And I have presented to a lot of high schools and to hundreds and hundreds of students. That is their number one question. What does a healthy relationship look like? They have a pretty good idea what an unhealthy one looks like.
Right.
What's a healthy one look like? And who is a safe adult? Who's actually safe? And I want to talk about that just for a second.
Please.
A safe adult is going to be somebody, I mean, they're never going to tell you, they're never going to isolate you. They are going to be your cheerleader. They're not going to have private conversations with you. It will all be out in the public. And what I say to parents, and I have sort of a fun little warning, bribes, threats, and pornography. So if anybody bribes you, I'll give you candy. I'll give you a designer bag. I'll give you fancy shoes. That's a warning sign. Threats, I'm going to hurt you if you don't do this. I'm going to kill your little brother. I'm going to hurt your parents. That's a threat. And then pornography, they say, hey, watch these pictures. This is cool. All cool kids do it. That's a red flag. So again, bribes, threats, pornography. To youth, I would say that is absolutely red flags, danger zone. And again, I want to go way back. In terms of stats, those that get into the sex industry, and that's what I want to prevent,
Right.
don't get out. We say 1% to 5% actually get out. The rest are drug addicted, mentally ill, commit suicide, or are murdered. And the one name I always mention is Robert Pickton. And I will, in every presentation, I say, Robert Pickton, Robert Pickton, Robert Pickton. This industry, the sex industry, is deadly. It kills. Yeah. And RCMP, the police agencies, and I work closely with them, they all say the same thing. We are tired of picking up dead bodies.
Of course.
So I'm going to say to your audience, please, and to parents and anybody that's listening, report, 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 report. If you see anything, if you suspect anything, report. Because again, I really want to pull this all together in a nice little package. Politicians tell me there's not a problem because they say there's no data.
Yeah.
And there's no data because people aren't reporting. It's super simple.
Exactly. And that's the scary thing, because again, we're in the school safety realm, right? And we deal with lots of districts in the US, and we're able to see some of those the data pieces from schoolsafety.gov, and where we can see the reporting of data, right? And the districts the school districts that have no concerning data to report, those are the ones I'm most concerned about. So, and I think this is a really important kind of segue to talk about, because right now what we are talking about is extremely important. And I think people listening right now might hear these extremes and kind of tune out, because to your point, a lot of the problems is we don't have that here. We don't have those issues here, but obviously we do. And I think what's important is people don't know what they don't know. So I want to focus for a little bit on some of the misconceptions that exist within human trafficking, human smuggling, all those aspects, because, in past interviews, I've heard you say that, oh, those are things that happen in Thailand and the Philippines and all these different types of, human trafficking, what that looks like. But I think for the purpose of people who are listening today, right, what are some of those common misconceptions? Because even today, you still people here describe the pimps as like the traditionals you would see like in the 80s and 90s, right? The cane and the big hat and all those things, the big chain, like that's still in people's minds of what those potential lures and groomers look like. But as you mentioned from your stats earlier, that's clearly not the case. They look like your average citizen over 50 making so over amount of money a year. So I think, what are some of the common misconceptions that we and you come across during your work and hopefully kind of dispel some of those myths?
I'm going to give one because, again, I'm an educator, I'm a teacher. I don't want to overwhelm everybody. I want to keep it very simple. The most common misconception is this idea that sex work is work. Mm-hmm. That is a lie. That is not true. And it is the biggest misconception from the sex industry because they want to legitimize the sex industry. And this is a multi-million, billion-dollar industry. And I'm not just talking about prostitution. I am talking about pornography as well. And I do want to give the stats and list some of the new trends. But 13 years old is the average age of entry into the sex industry. But in the urban areas, it's really dropped down to 10 to 12 years old. So that's grade 4, right. Grade 5, grade 6. So really, in terms of safer schools, you want to be talking about these issues before that. Yeah. We're talking grade 3 and younger. Yeah. And again, your allies, your best allies are your parents, and you really want to draw them in. But we say 50 to 90% are Indigenous. They are severely overrepresented in the sex industry. We really need to reach them. So they have the education. 95% actually want out of the sex industry, and they're stuck. They can't get out. We don't have the off-ramps. We say 90 to 95% that are in the sex industry are trafficked. So most have a pimp. Not all, but the majority do. And only 1 to 5% get out, as I mentioned. And I mean, the likelihood of getting murdered is just so high once you're in the sex industry. We say 40 times the national average. So, I mean, it's really horrendous. I find that once people know these stats, then they get concerned. Mm-hmm. But I don't want people to get so concerned they freak out. I want you to get so concerned that you actually do something. And just by talking about this issue, that's the magic key, is talk, talk, talk.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I'm happy we're doing this. And, the specific word that you mentioned, trafficked, these youth as early as 11, 12 years old are being trafficked. And I still think people have this misconception of what traffic means. Usually they think it's like they're being kidnapped. They're being brought into this world forcefully. But I think there's a key difference that people need to understand what that pathway looks like. Do you want to go into a little bit more detail on that?
Yeah. So I'm going to give sort of the 5 main tactics that traffickers use. Number 1 is a lover boy or a Romeo pimp. They pretend that they're a boyfriend. And the girls will say to me, well, he was a really lousy boyfriend. But he's a boyfriend. So it's a lover boy, Romeo pimp. That's very common. Number 2 is snatch and grab, is the kidnapping. And we have guerrilla pimps that are here in the Lower Mainland that do just that. They're very dangerous. And you have those gangs certainly down in the States, very dangerous. Number 3 is the renegade girl who just out of curiosity wants to make money. She starts doing OnlyFans, that app.
Right.
It basically is an adult website.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? It's a prostitution website, and they get onto OnlyFans thinking they're going to make a lot of money. Number 4 is the runaway, unhappy home life, and the girl will run. That is not uncommon with the Indigenous, especially if they've been given a device, and traffickers will track them down on the device on an app very quickly and just say, well, meet me out on highway such and such, and I'll pick you up and take you down to the big city, and we're going to have a lot of fun and everything else. So the runaway, that's a big problem, particularly, again, in the Indigenous. When we talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, how many of them, when they go missing, are they reported? And we really have to, if somebody goes missing, please, again, report. If the police don't have the data, they don't have the numbers, they're not going to do anything. Yeah. And number 5 is a female friend. And we're seeing more and more of this in high schools, junior highs, and even elementary school in grade 5, grade 6, grade 7, where an older girl, she'll be popular, she'll dress, she's cool, and she'll get her girlfriends to come to a party, and then they're sexually molested or assaulted or whatever. But then it's all cool. So there really is a scary, scary trend of making that cool. So I'm going to really quickly, again, I've always asked, what are the recent trends? Well, this is hot off the press. These are the 12 trends that I have observed.
Yeah.
The biggest thing we have in BC right now is hard drugs has been decriminalized. And I want everybody to understand this is really, really scary. We have to stop this, because I'm getting phone calls from all small communities now in BC going, all our youth are experimenting with hard drugs because the government says it's okay. They're not going to get caught. There's no repercussions. There's no deterrent. So when you have drug use, you're going to have sex trafficking, because the two go together. A girl, when she's hooked on drugs, is going to sell her body for sex. So please, the two very much go together. Next is our immigration numbers are high, so the new immigrants are very vulnerable for sex trafficking. Sexting has become normalized. That's a big problem. As a result, recruiting online is increasing. The big problem that I say and I see is the sexualization of youth, getting younger and younger and younger. That's why I say to parents, you need to have those healthy sexuality conversations by age 5. You've got to have those. Mayo Clinic pediatricians are saying that. Otherwise, you're going to have the internet and peer groups telling your children what to think or believe in. And you want your children to grow up with your values and your family values. Then there's the increase of childhood sexual assault. And because of pornography, we now have child-on-child sexual assault. That is exploding. We have fewer safe spaces for girls. And the really scary one, and I think you were just up in Prince George to address this issue, is there's an increasing abuse of boys. It typically happens on gaming sites where they're recruited. And the case of Carson Clellan, Prince George, I mean, absolutely tragic. And we have to stop this. But then I think of Amanda Todd. There's another case that we can all learn from. Pornography is unchecked. I've mentioned that at length. There is a lack of digital safety training where you come in. There's a lack of social media accountability. We really need positive parenting approaches. Parents don't know. They're overwhelmed. They're scared. That's why you and I are talking. And then unchecked artificial intelligence. I mean, that's going to open up a whole can of worms.
Section 302 is what you are describing for the social media companies and not being held liable. And this is specifically in the States. And obviously in Canada, yes, we have a lot of catching up to do. This is really, really fascinating to me. So for those who are unaware of what we're referencing right now, social media companies are unable to be held liable for third-party content. So what I use the example and the analogy of, let's say we have somebody who is so far down the pathway to violence that they have decided to commit a terrible act and they upload, let's say, a manifesto to 4chan or Reddit or wherever. They cannot be held liable for hosting that terrible, terrible content. You cannot sue those social media companies. So it's the same way where somebody is lured and groomed through Reddit or Discord or Telegram or whatever. You cannot sue those companies. There's a really interesting case that's happening right now. In 2022, there was a shooting a killing in Buffalo, New York at a supermarket. 10 people were killed. It was a racially motivated shooting. And there is a recent news article coming out that the defendants are prosecuting or looking to sue and prosecute the social media companies not because of their not because of that they hosted the content, but because of their algorithms. So they're going after it in the same way that, imagine, your Tesla is on autopilot and you crash, right? You can sue Tesla for the manufacturing defect. And that's what they're going after YouTube for, specifically in Facebook and Reddit. Had these algorithms not been in place to further self-radicalize this individual, they wouldn't have gone so far down that pathway, because that's what he's described as, a self-radicalized individual. He watches a YouTube video. And YouTube's like, well, people who watch this type of content will also watch all of this type of content and continue down that pathway. So they're kind of skirting around that Section 302. So I'm really interested to see where that goes, because that could have so many different implications with exactly what we're talking about right now. And this is also happening, I'm sure you heard of the Air Canada situation where somebody was looking for bereavement leave or like a discount on bereavement. So they were messaging Air Canada's website using their AI chatbot. And the AI chatbot was like, yes, you get this certain amount of discount if you do it, just go through here, blah, 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 blah. Air Canada then reaches out and says, well, actually, that's not the price. You have to pay more for whatever situation. And they are saying, well, we're not held liable because this AI chatbot, even though it's an Air Canada chatbot, is third-party content. So there's a lot of up in the air right now with this. So I'm excited to see where these go because they can have implications. But again, they're not coming fast enough.
No, absolutely. I think that's amazing, just what you described. I do want to mention Instagram and TikTok are the most popular with youth.
Oh, yeah.
And I want everybody to be very aware of that. Also, we need to reach our youth. For many, they are one decision away from success or failure.
Yeah.
And I do want to emphasize that. Also, crime follows the money. I mean, this is all money driven.
Yeah.
That's what is behind it. Also, it's really important that everybody knows where to get help. I'm back to the human trafficking. There is a human trafficking hotline number we have in Canada, 1-833-900-1010. Everybody needs to know that number. I phone it just to make sure somebody's going to answer the phone and that it actually works.
Right.
Also, I just want to say here in the Lower Mainland, British Columbia, the reason I didn't realize BC was so far behind every province in Canada in dealing with these issues, and we are by far. So think about it. We've had Reza Mazami, who's been our worst human trafficker, and he comes from North Vancouver. Reza Mazami, where I live, Amanda Todd, victim, and Robert Picton, he's a sex buyer and serial killer. So here we've had the three worst cases in the entire country.
Right.
So really, we should be cutting edge on dealing with this issue. We should be furthest out there because we've seen absolutely the most horrific cases.
Absolutely.
So if that doesn't give us all motivation and reason to really jump into this and to do what we can. Also, back to parents, I want to give 3 C's. I don't want to overwhelm parents, but I want to say be consistent, communicate, and always have consequences. So think that through. You want to be consistent, you want to communicate, and you want to have consequences. Also, you can say to your youth, yell, run, and tell. Super simple. If something's going on that's off, they can yell, they can run, and they tell. And it's really important, and I say this to youth all the time when I'm in high schools, talk to your parents. If this is something you can't talk to your parents about, that is a red flag for you.
Yeah.
That's probably something you should not be doing. Also, I'm going to say to all parents and frontline service providers and educators, the police agencies nearby are your best friend.
Yeah.
Get to know your RCMP, get to know your police really, 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 really well. They can actually do something.
Yes.
The rest can't. The rest of us can't. But that's why I am an advocate of the school liaison officer program in the schools.
Yeah.
They recognize trafficking. They recognize the gangs. They see what's going on. They can mentor at-risk youth.
Yeah.
Get to know them.
Yeah.
They're on our side.
They are there for the right reasons.
Thank you.
They have the proper
Thank
training,
you.
right? And that's why, again, this is just from what we've seen from, the past few years of school districts kind of getting rid of the SRO program. That puts a very much a heavy damper on the educators who are now trying to deal with these situations. And again, absolutely no disrespect to any general duty member who's coming into those schools and dealing with those situations, but they haven't built those relationships with youth and kids. And, they can be and absolutely are those trusted adults because they're there for the right reasons. And that's why the SRO programs are so important, because they receive specialized training for youth in dealing with these situations. So I couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much for that. And I do want to emphasize we have to reach our men and boys. In terms of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, it's men and boys that are the perpetrators. And we've got to talk about it. We don't need men and boys to be invisible anymore. They do cause this. And fathers really are the key to stop all of this. Every girl that I've talked to, survivor, without exception, has said to me, if I had a father that said, I love you, if I had a father that was my cheerleader, if I had a father that told me I was beautiful and special, I would have never gotten into the sex industry. So this is a call out to all fathers, but it's a call out to all men and boys. Be good men. Find out what that looks like. And I know a lot of men, if they would simply take time, and I think there's research on this, if men would simply take time to take inventory of their lives, who am I? What do I want to become? Just do that. And that changes everything.
It's huge. It's huge. And there's a huge, and this is getting a little bit off topic, but I think it's still important because there is a huge mental health crisis within boys and men as well. And a lot of that isn't necessarily brought up or talked about. And, it's just as simple as, who are those role models in my life? And the problem, what I see with the social media side, is you've got these, I'm not going to name names of some of these influencers that are out there, but there is this toxic masculinity that's very apparent in these cultures and climates that exist. And the issue is that they're the only ones who are validating young men's feelings. They are saying, yeah, you are depressed. You are feeling this way. What are you going to do about it? However, their undertones and everything there is deeply misogynistic in nature. They're putting the wrong information. They're starting at the right foundations of at least validating those feelings, but pulling in the complete wrong direction, in my opinion.
I just want to add to that. I think that's tremendous. So what we need to do is give men and boys responsibility.
Yeah.
Guilt is not a good motivator for anybody. But give men and boys responsibility. So in your families, for example, give boys chores.
Yeah.
So they're part of the family. Sit down and talk to them so that they feel that they're respected and they're understood. Take time with them. If they know that they're respected and understood, they will respect and understand others. And to any father, I would say the number one thing for a boy is that he's got to respect his mother. Yeah. It starts there. If he does not respect his mother, he's not going to respect the women and girls in his life.
100%.
So that is a huge one. If we can win over men and boys, we will turn back the dial on a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There's that huge power imbalance with those victims there. So I couldn't agree more. So you've done an amazing job of summarizing a lot of the points within your book. However, I still need everybody who's listening to look at Be Amazing, beamazingcampaign.org. Purchase the book, Child Sex Trafficking in Canada and How to Stop It by Cathy Peters. So you've talked about and summarized a lot of amazing points, a lot of amazing resources. Looking ahead, what are some future goals or projects you want to work on or are currently working on? I know you mentioned the second book is absolutely coming out. What are some other future goals that you want?
Well, I mean, my goal is to stop this. And I'm not going to stop until I stopped it, which means I'm going to talk all the time and everybody's going to hear from me. So it's just ongoing, doing more of the same. But the good news is doing a podcast like this gets the word out to more people and just spread the news. And I say to everybody, learn about this, share with your family and friends, and then alert the people in power so they know this is an issue.
Yeah. Well, Cathy, I can't thank you enough for being a part of this important conversation and sharing your information, your expertise. I think really helps open up the doors to some of the things that a lot of us may be noticing, might be seeing, but don't really understand what are some of those underlying tones there. And I think this is a really awesome way to shed that light on these really important aspects. So thank you so much for being a part of this conversation, Cathy.
Thank you for having me.
All right.